Hello and welcome to the second of three special launch events for the Global Health 50/50 report, Flying Gender Blind. What does this mean for health? And the pictures that you saw just now are taken from this year's photo essay competition that have been featured in the Guardian newspaper and also online. I'm James Chow. I'm a broadcaster. I'm host of the China Current. I'm based over in Hong Kong. I'm also a WHO Goodwill Ambassador for Sustainable Development Goals and Health. And here in my capacity as a very humble member of the Global Health 50/50 International Advisory Council. Today and together, we're going to explore the topic of redistributing power and privilege in global health. It's a topic, needless to say, that is imbued with new urgency 1 year on from the pandemic, that has had vast and unequal impacts on people's lives, on people's livelihoods, and on every part of our shared planet. COVID-19, I think we can all agree, is a very sobering and mournful reminder that progress towards gender equality is neither inevitable nor is it irreversible. And fueled by social justice movements around the world, the past year was also one in which organizations have been forced to face up to systemic imbalances in power and privilege. And yet, despite the flurry of commitments, despite all that we're hearing and seeing on our television screens and our iPhone screens on anti-racism, gender equality, and decolonisation, the Global Health 50/50 report comes to one damning conclusion, and that it shows very little substantive progress in equitable outcomes. I think all of us should be deeply shocked by that. We continue to see the same lack of diversity in leadership and boardrooms, and by implication, perspective and voices. In the face of multiple global crises, the question here, and I think the central question we should all ask ourselves, is this: can we afford a global health system that is dominated by individuals and institutions in high-income countries foregoing essential talent, knowledge, and expertise? And I was speaking to someone the other day, Kishore Mahbubani, the former Singaporean ambassador to the United Nations and the author of many, many books. He said, why are 12% in the West deciding and continuing to shape the futures of the other 88% elsewhere in the world? I'm really honored to be here today with our great panelists and all of you to explore what is needed to shift the dial, to move that needle so it goes to another part of that screen. What can we learn from the people who've been spearheading sustainable change despite threats to hard-won gains, and how together are we going to push our own leaders, organizations, and ourselves to embed the struggle for gender equality, diversity, and representation across our work to deliver health for all. I'm delighted to introduce you to the people who are going to color our thoughts over the next hour. Professor Sarah Hawkes, who's over in Cambridge, where she's going to be sitting beside Professor Kemp Buse. I'll introduce them more fully later. Catherine Chobotungi, who's over in Nairobi, and then we're going to go over to Geneva, where we have Taman Aluda. And last but not least, over in New York, we're very honored to be joined by Shamila Matri. We're going to have a first round of questions with our panelists, and then about halfway through the session, we're going to break and go to you to ask you the questions that you want answered. So you can see the chat feature on your Zoom. Just answer and put in whatever you want to ask our panelists, and I'll try as a moderator to get to as many of them as meaningfully as possible. So please pop your questions in and we'll raise those with them, and be ready to react and to respond, because we have a number of audience polls throughout the session. Speakers, gentle reminder, keep your responses to about 2 minutes if you can. And if you see me waving like this, please move on. Finally, we encourage you to share what you're hearing, what you're thinking, and what you're feeling on social media. Our hashtag there is hashtag GH5050, or you can go to hashtag Flying Blind, which is what we're using for all three events to launch this report. Now, I said there's going to be a bit of fun, a bit of interaction. Let's start with that part first. Audience, we're going to ask you a question. And it's a very present question if we're talking about decolonizing global health. Which region are you calling from? That's a question up for you there. And you can see the options, all the regions popping up over there. And if you scroll a bit down, you'll see a next question. What is your role? Are you a head of organization, for example, a student independent? And then lastly, I want to ask you, is your organization included in this 2021 report, if you know that, and if you've had a chance to read through the report. I'm going to give you a minute to get to those answers, and then we're going to reflect a little bit on the results. But in the meantime, Professor Sarah Hawkes over in Cambridge and otherwise over in London, if there wasn't a lockdown, how are you, and what are you thinking top line today as this launch event gets underway?
Oh, thank you, James. I'm very well, thank you. I hope you are too. Top line for me, I think, what I would love to be able to walk away in an hour knowing is a little bit more about what our esteemed panelists, but also our audience think we should be doing to shift that dial. So I'm going to present to everybody some evidence as to where we're at now. But I think the purpose of us all talking together over the coming hour is to really reach some ideas, to unearth some ideas about how we move forward more quickly, more equitably, and more inclusively.
And very quickly, Sarah, while we wait for the results to come up on the screen, I can see the sun streaming through your window, but you are living in the country in a number 3 lockdown. Is there still proof for and still evidence for hope?
There's some evidence for hope here in the UK, I think, James, in that we have been successful in vaccinating a substantial proportion of the population, but the hope and the real optimism will arise when we see that vaccine being rolled out equitably across the world.
Sarah, we've got some quick results over here. Everyone can see them. Better representation than we had in the first launch event. May I ask you to quickly reflect on that and then go straight into this great presentation that I know you prepared for us?
Yeah, my immediate reflection on this, James, is that I think what one of the things that we all need to reflect on in the coming hour is how we move this conversation outside of the current headquarters, the global headquarters, the geographical headquarters of where global health is currently situated. How do we get this conversation to become a meaningful participatory conversation for the 88%, as you mentioned? So just looking at the first question, we're clearly not quite there yet.
Okay, so let's go straight to the 2021 Flying Blind report. Sarah, what do we need to know about that?
Okay, I hope you can all see my screen. Sorry, let me just move this here a moment. So what I'm going to present over the next 7 minutes is a real snapshot of some of the vast amount of data that we have collected as part of the Global Health 50/50 2021 report. But I would encourage everybody on the call to dive much more deeply into the data, because I can't really do the data and the evidence justice in the space of 6 minutes. The report is structured around 4 key domains, and what I would very much like to emphasize on this slide is that these are not separate domains. We see these domains as very much interlinked. In other words, not only have you got a commitment to redistribute power, but what are you actually doing about it? And then what are the outcomes? And what does that mean for the beneficiaries of who your organization is trying to reach? So in the next few minutes, I'm going to focus on the variables that we have measured that are outlined, are highlighted in the yellow rectangles here. I'm going to be looking at what policies are in place to actually tackle the imbalances in power and privilege that we see across the global health system. And what does that actually translate to in terms of outcomes? What do we actually see in terms of who's currently running the system and how much they get paid, not to put too fine a point on it. So as I hope you're all aware, the Global Health 50/50 report surveys 200 organizations every year, looking across the range of domains that I showed you in the last slide. And we are an accountability mechanism. We are all about holding the global health system to account for its commitments on gender equality. And one of the key components that we see as being central to the notion of accountability is transparency. So what you see on this slide is our data on how transparent organizations are in terms of their commitments to having workplace policies in the public domain for gender equality. So we see that about 60% of the 200 organizations, we can actually find their workplace policies for gender equality in the public domain. And what you see on the right-hand side of the slide is that varies across the sectors. Some sectors are much more transparent in terms of their workplace policies than others. If we look beyond gender equality, which we will come back to, I'm sure, looking at diversity and inclusion policies more generally, we see that about half of organisations have those kinds of policies in the public domain. It's not just about whether you've got policies for career structures in place, it's about the supportive mechanisms to ensure that environments are non-discriminatory, that they are not, that people are not being bullied or harassed. And in particular, we look in very clear, we look in detail at the question of sexual harassment policies, because we know that sexual harassment in the workplace has been a real stumbling block to the progression of women's careers. And so we assess these policies across 4 domains, and we see the extent to which every organisation has got at least one of the 4 domains in their anti-sexual harassment policies. And you'll see that actually, you know, in the greater scheme of things, the policies aren't bad, they're quite comprehensive. But one of the things that we see lacking is the lack of mandatory training. So whilst the content of the policy is okay, there isn't a mechanism whereby all employees of an organisation are absolutely mandated to take part in training on that policy. Now, I don't expect anybody to look at this slide and be able to look at it, be able to analyse it in detail, but I do want you just to be able to look at the patterns. And what this slide is showing us is the extent of parental leave policies in each organisation. Because again, we know that becoming a parent, particularly becoming a mother, is a key point at which career opportunities take a real hit. And we see women's careers essentially falling off a cliff edge at the moment that they become a mother. And so the support that an organisation gives in terms of the amount of time and support for women and fathers coming back into the workplace really has an impact on the long-term career prospects of people in the workforce. And what we see on the left-hand side, where we see blue, that's support given to mothers. The right-hand side in yellow is support given to secondary carers, frequently fathers. We see a lot less time off being given to fathers. We see a lot less paid leave being given to fathers compared to mothers. And until we sort out that kind of inequality, we're really up against an enormous struggle to see gender equality at the top. And then finally, you know, we're all familiar with the term flexible working after a year in the pandemic, but flexible working is something that's been in existence in the workforce for many years. It has multiple meanings. It's not just about being able to work from home during COVID. And we see that 53% of organisations actually publicly state what their flexible working arrangements for employees were in 2020. So where does all that translate in terms of outcomes? Well, what we've seen across the global health sector, across 387 leaders, is that no change. In 4 years we've been measuring this data, we're still in 70% of the leadership are male, 72% are from North America and Europe, 84% are from high-income countries, 94% are educated in high-income countries. But I want you to just focus on this slide. This was the slide that in 2020 represents an opportunity for change. 1/4 of the leadership changed hands in 2020, and we didn't see any change in terms of who was newly appointed. This slide essentially represents a huge missed opportunity to actually start to redistribute power and privilege in the global health sector. And finally, last slide, even when you get to the top as a woman, what we see is at the very top of the leadership level, women are consistently earning less than men across a range of NGO organizations where we've been able to access salary levels, a consistent salary gap of $45,000 underpayment to women compared to their male peers. Thank you, James. Over to you.
Thank you, Professor Hawkes. A lot for us to think about, but I think a lot more for us to act on. We're going to bring up another poll for our audience, and let's get that up onto the screen right now. The poll is going to ask you about institutional issues. And one of the questions will be this: are the diversity and inclusion, sexual harassment, and parental leave policies of the place where you work or study easily accessible? And that's a yes, no, don't know. Then we're going to jump to the second question, which is, do you feel that you're able to push for equality where you work or study? And then, do you know what the gender pay gap is at the organization where you work or study? And lastly, do you feel the organization where you work or study is doing enough to address the unequal impacts of COVID-19 on people's working lives? Again, we're going to give you about a minute plus to get to those questions. There are 4 of them for you to respond to. I mean, in the meantime, Sarah, before we jump back into the audience, I'm shocked, as I said at the beginning of this, that your report, which is not just a report, it's really what Global Health 50/50 does that a lot of organizations are not able to do, is the incredible research and mining of data that you have at your fingertips, and then communicating that to everybody, be they global health experts or not. What arrogance is there in humanity that even after a year of being brought to your knees in a state of mourning and loss and reversal, that we still have not changed anything really in areas where it matters, and not only women at the top, but women on a progressive track where they deserve to be?
It's a really good question, James. And I mean, we are frequently told that it's only a matter of time. That, you know, if we just wait another 20 years, the gender pay gap will be X% smaller, or we might have Y% more chance of equality and diversity at the top. But I think that, you know, particularly that slide where we showed that even when you've had 1/4 of the leadership changing hands, that there has essentially been a maintenance of the status quo, really shows us that what we're actually struggling against is really entrenched historical systems, and that we need to tackle the systems of inequality, not just the question of leadership, for example.
Kent Bewes, Professor Bewes, I know we're going to introduce you more fully later, but perhaps you can give us a very, very quick reaction to the poll results that you're seeing in front of you.
Well, I'm very encouraged by the fact that people feel like they're able to push for equality. That then raises the question of why they maybe don't have the agency to actually bring about any change. And so maybe that's one of the things that we can talk about further down. Do you know what the gender pay gap is at your organization? Yes, that's 20%. No, that's 67%. One of our interesting findings at GH 50/50 is that very few organizations publish their gender pay gap. And interestingly enough, that in our sample, those that do exclusively, all of those that do are mandated to do so by law. So it would again suggest that these kinds of changes will come about not necessarily for people who feel like they can push from change from below, but that they need to push not only in the organization, but they need to push in society as well. So how can we amplify the voices of those people who feel like they can push for change, and how can we enable those who for some reason don't feel like they can push for change right now to push for that change? James.
And very quickly, do you feel the organization where you work or study at, the last one was about 44% apiece, and about 12% said don't know. So let's jump into the wider pool of speakers that you have invited here as co-directors of Global Health 50/50. We're delighted, as we said, to be joined by three fantastic speakers from Nairobi, from Geneva, and also New York. The first off is Catherine Chobotungi, who's Executive Director at the African Population and Health Research Center. Catherine, thank you very much for being with us. And I would like to ask you about your center, because it's recognized as a high scorer in the 2021 GH 50/50 report. As the head of an organization based in Nairobi, what are you up against in your efforts to shape a more equitable and diverse organization? And very quickly, if you could add to that, what works and what doesn't?
Thanks very much, James, and thanks everyone. And I'm delighted to be here. And we're happy to have been ranked amongst the high scorers. This is our second time, so we take it as a badge of honor. And I thought I could share my experience with regards to two specific interventions we had at the organization. And I think what you're up against, I think, is yourself and your fears. And of course, these are informed by the extent to which we have been socialized to accept things as normal. And I'll give two quick examples. And we overhauled our sexual harassment policy in the course of last year, and broadened this to talk about safeguarding generally, not just focused on sexual harassment. And so talking about it, and when we started, you encounter sniggers and disbelief from people who are hearing for the first time that certain behavior is not acceptable. And so at some point you're like, am I doing this right? Because maybe 5-7 years ago, you could have been in the same place. But then armed with facts, you keep on hammering the message home that it's completely unacceptable and will not be tolerated. And then over time, people start realizing that, okay, this is actually not acceptable. But it also shows you how most people do not know what's acceptable and what's not. And so we start from a place of, creating understanding about what is and what shouldn't. And then, be consistent about communication. So we communicate every single opportunity that you have to talk about those things that are important. We talk about them. Why are we doing this? How are we doing it? And where are we? So that was the first thing, really, that even myself, you have to confront your own fears and say, this is not acceptable, even though I knew different maybe a few years ago. Now, the second example was about reducing the gender pay gap. And we did a job evaluation exercise that was followed by, regrading all positions and then a new salary scale, and then trying to see where people were based on the new salary scales and the regraded positions. And after putting in all the numbers, it meant a 15% increment in our wage bill. So if we had implemented all the recommendations, we would have increased our wage bill by 15%. So it's like I asked myself, like maybe 5 years ago, I would have said, oh my God, this is completely undoable. So it's easy to share away and say this is impossible, it's unthinkable, giving the funding arrangements for an NGO that depends on soft money. But then the other question is like, okay, so it's 15%, is it completely impossible, or can we do it in another way? So we decided to stagger it, and within 2 years, we had actually implemented all the recommendations. So we are convinced that we are at a place of equal work, equal pay for everyone. We've not done an actual gap analysis, but we looked at people's work, what they do, their qualifications, and people got identical amounts of money. So I'm convinced if we did an actual analysis, perhaps we would find that our gender pay gap has reduced. But I think for me, it was that point of being confronted with a 15% increase in the wage bill, knowing the kind of arrangements that we have, and asking myself, can we do this or can we not? And saying, I think we can. So I'll go back to what you're up against, I think, is yourself and your fears. And if you confront them and refuse to accept what you've been socialized to accept as normal, then you can actually take some bold decisions. So other than communication, I would say measurement, monitoring, learning, and taking action. If you're not measuring things, it's hard to do anything about them. And if you measure things and you get some results, then do something about that. So I think that I would say those are the things that have worked quite well: communication, and then the measurement and learning that comes with it.
Thanks very much, Catherine. Yourself and your fears. That's something I wrote down because that's really, really important as well. Catherine, we're going to come back to you a little bit later. In the meantime, let's jump over to Geneva, where we're joined by Tamam Alouda, who's the Senior Strategic Advisor for Access Campaign at Médecins Sans Frontières. Tamam, welcome to our broadcast tonight. You've been vocal about the need for global health to confront and overcome its colonial roots. What would you say global health and humanitarian sectors are doing to that? And how do you think we can measure the change on whether they're successful in living up to that challenge or not?
Thank you, James, for having me. And it is, of course, terrifying in a way to look at the outcomes, whereby we're left with 2% of the leadership of global health who are women who are educated in low-income countries. And this is significant in itself because it shows the overlapping and intersecting problems and vulnerabilities that are imposed on people. So we are not only talking about gender or about skin color or nationality, we're talking about a mix whereby all those items end up disadvantaging very specific groups. I'll tell you a bit of story that I've had in sitting on a meeting of a senior management of an NGO once. Newly appointed general director and 2 other directors were present, and a male European director said, "Oh, now my boss and most of my colleagues are women, so fine, we're done, we're a feminist organization now." And it was only half joking. What I'm saying is representation is important and it has to be strove after. But representation will hardly work towards changing all the power dynamics without acknowledging that the world view that creates most of that we inherit from obviously colonial powers, but from multiple power asymmetries, is going to resist change. It would be slightly naive to think that just by informing the global health sector how weakly are they doing, that will lead to change. And that is the next step. So now we have a consistent and measurable diagnosis. How do we imply it in a change that is useful, that retains the best aspects of the global health sector, but overcomes the power dynamics that only replicate themselves? We risk, by engaging exclusively in a representation or diversity and inclusion conversation, which obviously from the report, we're not doing that very well, picking people who look different but act the same, and refusing to integrate worldviews that are entirely different to the dominant one. And that is a problem because that will end up not changing the appearance, but probably not the substance, and continuing to deprive people we serve at the end of the day from their agency and their choices. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tamam. And a quick call out to everybody watching us. If you're watching us on Zoom, please ask us questions because I'm about to come to the audience part and I don't have enough questions from you yet. We've got about 2 so far. I don't want to ask all the questions. We would love for you to do the honors of that. Thanks very much, Tamam. And let's go now to Shamila Matri, who many of you know is the Deputy Director of the Public Health Program at Open Society Foundation. Shamila joins us over from New York. Shamila, welcome. And may I ask you about this GH 5050 report, which we heard a little bit about in a snapshot through Sarah. It warns that growing talk on gender equality is being used as a substitute for meaningful action to confront power imbalances, bias and discrimination. My question to you is this: why do you think so many are failing to act? What should organizations be doing to prevent this gap between commitment and reality from widening even further, particularly in light of the disruptions and growing inequalities wrought by COVID-19 alone?
Thank you, James, and hello, everyone. And also, thank you to Global Health 5050 for really putting gender front and center, and especially in this pandemic time. You know, James, the question that you raised about why this failure to act, I think is really important. And I must say, sitting here in the US in this time, I'm actually really stumped. How many more bodies of women of color, Asians, of Blacks, of Muslims, of Roma need to be killed or assaulted? And I know this report is about the workplace, and that actually is the power of this report. Because if we can do better by our institutions where we work, then actually we do better for society. And I think that the report lays out different definitions of gender, but really speaks to about the systems of power, which I think really COVID has revealed more than ever. So the more need for this type of report to address the asymmetries that we're finding and the hierarchies of agency, knowledge, and resources. So you asked the question of what can organizations do? But as part of that gendered analysis, I think before we get to the what, I think this time we need to think about more how. How are we working? Representation is clearly important, but I think we need to be really probe deeper. Starting more at the individual level, we need to probe ourselves, our positionality, our privileges, question and understand the histories, the cultures, and ask, why do certain styles of speaking or leadership or presenting need to be valued more than others? At the institutional level, in this pandemic, we do know that racialized communities are bearing the brunt, both the health and the economic impact. So we need to ask in terms of organizations, have these organizations, as their offices have stood empty, have they continued the contracts of the cleaners and security guards? I know that in the US, New York, these are primarily immigrants and women. So I'm going to call this, I think what the report speaks to is really the office justice space. And Sarah, you talked at the beginning about the vaccine rollout, and I was really pleased to see the report actually talked about what organizations do. It's on page 114, by the way. And, you know, I want to go from the office justice space to the vaccine justice space. And as part of a gendered analysis, we need to take a structural perspective. We need to ask, why is the current system of research development led to countries having supplies that exceeds their demands, while there's others demands that exceeds the supply? I think at the moment, the vaccine rollout data indicates that about 10 countries have administered 75% of the vaccines, where there's about 113 countries that even haven't received a single dose. So this is where the racial justice, the gender justice, and the decolonial analysis really reveals the maldistribution of power, of politics, and money. So I see James, can you coming in? Do you want me to stop?
No, but I'd love for you to finish your thoughts, but also because I've got questions for you also.
Okay, I think that here what I want to say as we go, when we talk about vaccine justice and we talk about gender and disrupting power, one of the things we need to do is ask where what OSF is doing. I'm going to make a plug for the work that we're supporting, is we're really disrupting the monopoly of power of the vaccine manufacturers who are primarily based in northern countries. Do you realize that in Africa, that only 1% of the vaccines that are actually used are actually produced in Africa? So maybe we need to look at how we can change and disrupt the power and the monopoly of the research and development paradigm.
Thanks very much.
My vaccine justice pitch.
Thanks very much, Sharmila. I'm going to ask the audience, because we've got a couple of questions coming in, to hold tight because we're going to get to those questions. But in the meantime, we want you to do a bit more work for us in answering and interacting with our third and final poll. Here it comes up onto your screen right now, because we're going to ask that central question that we put to Catherine. How does change come about? Are the diversity and inclusion, sexual harassment, and parental leave policies of the place where you work or study easily accessible? Sorry, that was the wrong one. looking at how change comes about, what do you think are the top 3 barriers to more equal, diverse, and inclusive workplaces in global health? Now, we know you're going to need more time for this because we've given you and tried to give you as many of the accurate choices that we think will cover your bases. It goes from resistant leadership through to staff not mobilized, ending with leadership not accountable, and broader social norms. We'll give you time to look at that in more detail. But if we quickly look down at the second question, is what do you think would be the 3 most effective ways to drive change to create more equal, diverse workplaces in global health? So we're going to leave you to answer those questions while I fill in with a bit of my own thoughts over here. Because, you know, yesterday when we were prepping for this, I was thinking about where we are at with the word decolonisation. And in some ways, would it be more appropriate, Sarah put to us, to talk about anti-imperialism? Because there is a subtle nuance between the two. And then another thought came to mind, which I asked Sarah and Kent about, which was you've got gender equality on one side and you've got decolonising global health on the other side. Is it me and my imagination, or are these 2 separate camps in many people's minds? And I think Sarah was saying that very much that is the case, but we need to look at them as natural allies that work hand in hand and go together. So you're not trading off one for the other, but it's a bit like the SDGs. Instead of thinking of it in silos, you've got them working together naturally. I mean, they build one on top of the other. I think, Sarah, I summarized that correctly. But in any case, we'll see if we can get to those results pretty soon. If you've already ticked off on those, Imogen's going to bring up the results on our screen. And let's see if we can see that before we jump into the audience interaction. I mean, there you can see the results for yourself, so I won't comment on that, but you can see where most of you lie on that. A lot of you talking about resistant leadership, leadership not being accountable, broader social norms. And going down to the second part, and perhaps Imogen, we can leave this up for another 30 seconds so people can look through them. We've got staff collective action / trade unions, funding incentives, but really look at that, almost 80% saying more diverse leadership, including women and leaders from low middle income countries. And on the third bit, the big winner, quote unquote there, yes, 69% to the question of, do you feel more optimistic? Okay, those are the poll results. Let's go now to the Q&A from our audience. Well, oh gosh, you went from 2 questions to about 10 in a couple, more than that, 20 in a couple of minutes. Okay, very, very quickly, some quick reactions from any of the panelists, please. Jay Goulden, who I think works for Care International, and the other day he tweeted something about institutional racism in the aid sector. He says, why do you use high-income countries as a category for geography rather than, say, the global south? Is it the same for organization leadership to come from a more recently high-income country, such as Chile or Uruguay, as it is for it to come from the West, as James put it in his quote, or the geographical headquarters where global health organizations are traditionally led from, the global north, or as I think Sarah said, the global health headquarters being in the north. Tracy Baird, who is the president and CEO of Engender Health, says, excellent point about pay gap reporting, Kent. We report our pay gap and are not required of US NGOs at this point. I'd be happy to advocate for pay gap reporting to be required in the United States. Global health donors could require it, and that would prompt almost immediate change. What would it take to get donors to push for this change? And before we jump onto the rest, we can take it section by section. Divya Bajpai, Dr. Bajpai, who I think is based over in Mumbai. She's an associate professor for nephrology. She says, how do we decolonize global health within a colonized system worldview? Where do we start? Can we just go for one of those from the panelists? Dr. Bajpai's question, how do we decolonize global health in a colonized world? One idea, Catherine, one idea.
I mean, I think I'm an admirer, if I could say that, of the decolonize global health movement. But sometimes I pause and ask and say, decolonize seems also like something which is active and which is coming from the same colonization sort of power base. So I sort of struggle with that. And my contribution has been that I think the decolonization movement needs to define an objective and some kind of roadmap. And then we can see, okay, this is where this is taking us. Because I think for now, there's a lot of excitement, but it's still a lot of talk without some kind of structure. And I think just yesterday, there was a paper published about that, some kind of roadmap. And I think that's a good beginning point, because that allows us to interrogate this roadmap. Is it taking us where we want to go? And then we can see how to support it.
Okay, does anybody quickly want to respond to Tracy's take, which is what would it take to get donors to push for the change? Where she said she's prepared to put her hand up and push for that change across the board. Report your pay gap, whether you're required to or not. Who wants to give that a quick go? Taman?
Yes, well, as long as we differentiate the ends and means, because the donors aren't absolved of the same problems that we're trying to solve ourselves, and donors are biased and are part of the power structures that is imposing those differences. So while I wouldn't claim to say, no, don't do that and improve the situation immediately, I would still look at a situation where both donors and global health actors are more compliant and more and less affected by the power diseases that we are talking about.
And we also thank Carl Hoffman, who is the president and CEO of Population Services International, for joining us. He made a comment here: GH 5050 continues to drive attention and change. Bravo. The data on new CEOs is striking. Is it time to bring greater focus to NGO boards of directors? These are the ones hiring CEOs after all. Do we have strategies for bringing boards more into the conversation? I don't know if anybody wants to respond to that or not in about 30 seconds, but very quickly, an anonymous submission was: what advice can panelists give to small organizations with very little HR/operations capacity to implement progressive policies and collect and publish data, for example, on the gender pay gap? So Shamila, I mean, if you're not Open Society, and if you're not Médecins Sans Frontières, or if you're not a major center over in Nairobi, what do you do? And what can you do with a limited capacity? In 30 seconds, what would you advise?
I would say ask your funders for funds for this. I think there's a movement among funders to give what's known as institutional grants, like open grants, so people can use this to not only just do the work of the project, but also strengthen their organization.
And do what Catherine says. Think of yourself and put away your fears, because I think going to ask your funders for that sometimes requires quite a lot of courage to do that. But I think, Shamila, that was a very, very practical take on what you can do to overcome that barrier over there. Thanks for that. We're going to jump into a last round of questions, and you can see the questions up on there for yourself. We're going to leave that up on there for the rest of this session. But I do want to go to some closing thoughts from everybody. Catherine, may I return to you after I speak to Kent? Kent, thanks very much for being with us. You're the co-director of Global Health 5050. As everyone knows, you're also in a new role as Director of Healthier Societies over at the George Institute for Global Health. Kent, you spent your career analyzing policy change. What do you think are some of the essential ingredients that you would grab from the wall and put into the pot and then stir with your cooking spoon? Because you're a good cook, I know.
Thanks, James. Well, actually, you asked about stories, and so I wanted to go back and remind you that you and I met and worked early when we first met. One of our first gigs was doing something with Annie Lennox at the AIDS conference in Vienna in 2010. And in fact, we were working with Sonia Tanaka, who I want to give a shout out to right now, who's the primary author of this report. We were working together to script that event at an AIDS conference. And you might remember that what we scripted was as much about human rights, women's rights, and social justice as it was about AIDS itself. So I think there's a lesson in there. I think there are a few lessons in there, and I think that there are a number of lessons, in fact, from the AIDS movement for this conversation on decolonization and gender equality that you and Sarah were talking about linking up in relation to how you overcome sort of organizational inertia and organizational path dependency. And just to remind you, when the AIDS movement was asking pharma for treatments, non-existent treatments, when the AIDS movement was asking for universities to do clinical trials more quickly, when the AIDS movement was asking the FDA to fast-track regulatory processes, when the AIDS movement was asking the WTO to change intellectual property protections, and Tamam will know this very well from the MSF Access to Meds movement, it didn't just present the evidence on what was wrong. When they wanted these organizations to think differently about the impediments that business as usual was, the problems that were being created like that, as I said, they didn't focus just on the evidence, and that is one of the things that we do at GH 5050. It organized, it mobilized, it protested, and held officials and organizations to account. To uphold really a series of rights, and a series of rights that they themselves helped to clarify. As Catherine said, they basically got a conversation going about what are acceptable norms and what are not acceptable norms. I was just going to say, around the GH 5050 link to this, our strap line is to inform, to inspire, and incite. And I think that we inform with the evidence we have in our report. Our report also has a number of examples that hopefully will inspire people. And just going to one of the questions there that wasn't answered, that Sharmila answered in a lovely way in terms of going to your donors. But I was just going to say that our GH 5050 website also has a series of resources that smaller NGOs can access in terms of human resource policies and so on. So we've done quite well, I think, to inform and inspire. But I think from a political science perspective, it raises the questions of what more can we do to incite? And three things there, I think, and Carl Hoffman, I see in the chat, brought up one of them. I think that we need to follow the power. And one area that there's clearly power is in the boards. And at GH 5050 and others, I think we need to do more to engage with the boards. So we need to, of course, as Sharmila said, focus on the individual, confront our fears. I think we need to focus on the leadership of the organizations, the CEOs, but I also think we need to get to the boards. And I think Carl Hoffman is right on that one. Second, I think we need to organize and unite as a community. We need to organize, mobilize, and protest, and we need to support one another to hold these organizations to account. And then third, I think that we need to change our mental maps, to go back to what Catherine said about what is acceptable, and that we need to find links to other movements that also agree that change needs to happen. And so coming back then to the question of these organizational policies, I think it does us damage when we treat them as technical documents that the human resource departments have. These are political declarations around equality or inequality, depending on how they're written. And we need to focus, we need to see them as such. And I think that we need to link what's in those documents to what we think is the new norm, or ought to be the new norm, in terms of around social justice and equality. So from a political science perspective, James, I think we do need to think about where the sources of power are, and we need to challenge them and resist them, again, as Tamam suggested that we ought to be doing.
Sarah, did I see you tapping Kent on the back of his back? I did.
It was a go for it. It was actually a fist race. Go for it.
I have very good eyes, but I also just want to quickly say that here, what Kent said, don't be afraid to piggyback on the train on other issues that are leading, whether it be climate change, whether it be displaced and refugee communities. And don't be afraid if you're not the head of that train as well. It's not always about making sure that you're seen up front and center, because it all will pay dividends for everybody at the end of the day. Ken, you maybe think of one thing, because when you were presenting all those scenarios at the beginning of your response, what about all those people who poured out onto the streets in the most advanced economy in the world in the early 1980s, demanding that they be given a chance to live. I think that's the most powerful and emotional and impactful thing that we can still learn from them 40 years on from 1981, when the first cases of AIDS were identified in New York and San Francisco. Shamila, I'm coming to you. I was going to ask you for your thoughts on the levers for a system-wide change, but may I rephrase it in a much more articulate way through one of our audience, Zara T, who says something a little bit similar, but in a far more sophisticated way than I could come up with. She says, from a South African perspective, I do think the shift to anti-imperialism would be valuable. It seems to put the onus more on addressing the negative invisibilizing aspects of imperialism than returning to a pre-colonial time, which is how many people perceive the concept of decolonization. What's your reaction to that, please?
She is totally right on. And I just want to say that, definitions and constructs, they are meant to be discussed. They're meant to be questioned. And only through that, and through that discussions and dialogues, are we going to get the change. I must say, you asked James for a story, where here we are talking about imperialism and decolonization. And I'm sitting in a philanthropy. I'm sitting in the US. I have a Canadian passport. I have a Canadian accent. And I think recognizing that is really important. And I think as a funder, I am going to shift to a funder because I've been on the other side. And Kent, thank you for mentioning the AIDS movement and the importance of civil society. But I think in this time, funders really need to put the money into the countries, they're not the ones that define the problem. And I think, Zara, part of this is like, who's defining the question that needs to be resolved? Are we looking at the gendered issues, the race issues? Are we looking at addressing the legacy of colonialism and not romanticizing it? I think that intersectionality, and I know the report speaks to that, is really key of how we address some of these issues. And I think funders have to start to maybe just let go, and OSF being one of them. So I will stop there.
Thank you very much, Shamila. And I can't finish without quoting Lezenia Weeks, who I think is the same person as Lezenia Weeks Richmond, who is a senior manager over at the NHS, used to be with PIH, and describes herself on her Twitter not only as a lover of Haiti, but very importantly, decolonizing global health enthusiast. That's a whole new description that I think all of us should wear with pride. Lezenia says, will future reports look at the intersectionality of race and gender? The gender equality agenda is very advanced, but not so much in terms of racial equality, especially in senior management positions in global health. It is still very white male dominated. Catherine, with that in mind, I would like you to provide us with some of the thoughts that we should be going away with today, which is how do we move beyond the notion of fixing the individual to getting people with power to do the hard work of changing systems, institutions, and norms, because it's so easy to ask the ones who put in the miles to keep doing that, but it's much harder to say, you can do it, make it happen. So what do you say?
I mean, I think for me, it's the realization that as a sort of a recipient, somebody on the receiving end of inequality, that we also have to put in the hard work, and that we can't expect that the perpetuators of inequity are the ones who are going to undo the inequity. I think it's that realization. So I think recognizing inequality, giving it some kind of form and description, and then having the courage to reject it. And I think courage comes from asking yourself, what's the worst that can happen if I reject this kind of for instance, engagement that you think is inequitable and is not meaningful or is exploitative? I think what's the worst that can happen? So once you reach that point, then you realize actually the worst that can happen is that maybe perhaps you shift the mindset of the perpetuator. Yeah, I'm using air quotes here. So I think for me, it's that we all have a part to play, and we need to figure out what it is, what part can we play, and we shouldn't work on the assumption that everybody recognizes inequality. If you recognize it as a recipient, perhaps the perpetuator doesn't. And so we have a role to play, in that.
Okay, Nazra Amin says, she says, many critics believe that health outcomes and quality of life may actually be worsened by the decolonized global health movement. What are your thoughts on this? How can I, as an avid supporter of this movement, counter this claim? I'm not sure we got time to answer that, or whether somehow it's blended in, and there's even more out there, as you can see on the open Q&A. But I'd just like to hand over the floor to you, Sarah, and take it away with a big bang finish for us, please.
Well, I'll try for a big bang finish. I did think that Tamam might be able to come in and actually link up the decolonization of the notion of decolonizing the global sector and who gets to benefit from the global health sector.
Should we go to Tamam first?
I'm happy to hand over to Tamam to speak to whatever you want to speak to, Tamam.
I'll try the 60-second approach. First, assuming that things can get worse, no one could promise otherwise. But there are two things here. First, it assumes that things are going well. And if anything, COVID-19 shows us that things aren't going well for people who are poor, racialized, oppressed, or excluded. And COVID-19 didn't add much that is new. We've known for decades about the discrimination and exclusion. It just now happens about a topic that people in rich countries care about because they are threatened by. So the exclusion of people with diseases that do not affect the rich countries have been happening. It's just that now we hear about COVID. So things aren't really going all that well that we have so much to be afraid to lose. Second, in principle, when we work on a field that promises equality and operates on intrinsic inequality, there's a point where we say it has to be changed in principle. No one defends, now at least, well, some people do, but hopefully marginal enough, that we should have kept colonization. It was really swell. When it happens, it is a marginal voice because the recognition of the intrinsic injustice in it is prevailing. And that has to happen now. Not many people think that the inequalities in global health are very bad now, just probably as not many people in the West at least thought very badly about the British Empire when it was in its heyday. Some certain ministers might actually break in reciting Kipling sometimes in Myanmar or the other. Not everybody thinks about it that way, but it has to be opposed in principle. The point here is, there is a movement that is emerging that is calling itself decolonizing global health. And that's valuable because we have 100 years of literature about opposing power that has happened through colonial and post-colonial studies. But it's also important because we need to listen. All of us, those who are at the top and in the middle. Lioba Hirsch wrote recently, can we really expect decolonizing that started in the field to be concluded on round tables and boardrooms? In the Lancet, we need to take ownership. Individually, we now refuse to sit on a panel that is all men. Maybe we should refuse sitting on panels or meetings or that are all, all white males, like most of the heads of the organizations here in Geneva are. There are plenty we can do. No one is saying kill the global health system today to rid it of its coloniality, but it has to be acknowledged and we have to act strongly towards it, with it not shyly, not beggingly, but with quite a bit of conviction. Thank you.
And we will also just tell you that Shamila left a little note that I'm not sure all of you can see, but it says that decolonization stems from alma mater. It is not new. We need to accelerate our work. Sarah, this is the point where I get to hand over to you for that big bang finish, please.
To be really honest with you, James, I think Tamam has actually captured the Big Bang finish. But I think you made a really, really important point there, Tamam, that certainly here in the UK, and this is replicated across many countries, we have got a leadership that is more versed in the words of Kipling than Frantz Fanon or others. And until that changes, then we will continue to be having these conversations. But what I think where we're coming from within GH 5050 is that change in leadership is a start, but it's not the be all and end all. That what we need is a systemic change to disrupt structures, and that's not in the hands of benign leadership change, that's in the hands of all of us. So I think I'd like to finish on that point, James, that we are all the agents of change here. Thank you.
That's really wonderful. Professor Sarah Hawkes, Professor Kemp Buse, Catherine Chomotungi, Tamam Alouda, and Shamila Matre. It's been such an honor to learn from you today. That marks the end of our time together. Thank you to everybody, including those of you at home, in the office, or in lockdown, somehow, somewhere. Thank you for choosing to spend your time with us. And I encourage you to keep engaging on Twitter, putting your questions and comments there, and just leaving us with some ideas as we move out of this second to going on to a third launch event about what you see and what you feel. Hashtag us again at GH5050 or Flying Blind. And let me challenge you each to share what you've learned today with an equal number of women and men, because we had problems finding a man to write a foreword for the report this year. So we created an empty space for people to do just that. Check out the Gender and Health Index to see how your organization is performing and explore the huge range of resources and recommendations from Global Health 5050 and what we each can be doing to drive change within our organizations and across global health. And not just change, but really meaningful change. And not just gender equality and decolonizing global health separately, but in parallel as entry points to all social justice for everybody. We'll see you for the final event, where we'll be talking about transformative change on gender and equity. What will it take